Welcome to the InPower Coffee Break, everybody. Today, our guest is Priyanka Komala, and we're here. She's joined us before, and she's going to join us again to talk about millennials in the workforce, and particularly how, what's happening with millennials now that they're maturing into middle management. By 2020, millennials will be more than half the workforce, and a good number of them will be in management. So when we look at millennials as leaders, I hope in this conversation we're going to reframe how we talk about them a little bit differently than the way millennials are often talked about, which is those kids, because they're really not kids anymore. And Priyanka is a millennial, probably on the slightly older end of the spectrum, but not old. I'll take that moniker in this conversation. And her role, she's the lead for tech and digital strategies, kind of the intersection of science and technology at the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. She's also an advocate and speaker on her own experience and women in the workforce and a number of other things. And she's just had a very exciting invitation to her alma mater to speak there. And I'm going to ask her to sort of introduce herself in that context here in a minute before we jump into the conversation. But I want to invite you to follow us live here on our Facebook page, as well as on our website. You can learn more about how to join the conversation via chat or via video at coffeebreak.InPowerCoaching.com. You can find past recordings there from our previous guests, and also a link to our iTunes podcast, where we encourage you to follow us on podcasts and YouTube. So we give you lots of ways to follow this conversation and participate in it, and we hope you will. So Priyanka, why don't you give us sort of the vision of yourself right now. You know, I've known you now for several years. We've had multiple conversations, and you've helped us in these coffee breaks. You've written on our blog. You've let me mentor you a little bit here and there, which I appreciate. And so kind of where is Priyanka now before we dive into this situation? And why don't you maybe open also a little bit with your view of leadership from where you sit now?
Thank you, Dana. It's such a pleasure to be on your show, and I really appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with you in several different ways. And it's such a pleasure to speak about millennials and leadership the way I see myself. It's been a great learning experience for me, especially for somebody who comes from a different country, trying to identify what do I want to do with my life, articulating my goals, trying to create a niche for myself, and then building an identity. Those are different parts of the puzzle, but that's where I see myself. It's been my Asian parents' ambition, and maybe the only thing that they wanted to do with their life was to give us the best education. And I think that drives me forward when I'm looking at things that I want to do for myself and for the other people in the community. It started with, what do I do for myself? And then as you're rising through your career experiences, I'm looking at how can I help others succeed as well? How do I bring people together and then make this a better place for all of us? So that's been my vision. And I love to share my stories. If that can be an ounce of inspiration to somebody else, I think that's success to me at the end of the day. And I think that's the success for the society and for my parents.
So I want to talk more about millennials and leadership, but you just said something really interesting to me. You said you started with wanting to, support yourself and build yourself into a good leader so that you could help others. And so many people, especially women, but not only women, we're all about the other people, and we support other people, and we kind of forget about ourselves and have to come back around when we're depleted or tired or stressed and remember ourselves. So did you start out with yourself, or did you have to learn that lesson, like I have to start with myself before I help others?
I didn't have a linear path going through this, and for me, it's surrounding myself with great people who are really successful, who love to inspire and instill the confidence in others. I think that's where I drive my inspiration from. Initially, I would always look at how do I help others succeed? And then one of my mentors actually came to me and said, it has to be a mutual win-win. There's only so much you can give back, but at the same time, you also need to look at what do you get from the other person, right? From different standpoints. It could be as simple as some inspiration that you can get. When you have moments of self-doubt, those could be tiny nuggets of wisdom that you can get from them at different stages of your life. And I've really realized, Dana, being a millennial, instant gratification is something that we always look for, but at the same time, sometimes it really helps to have that self-care and being obsessed about keeping yourself happy. Because I've realized when I'm happy, when I'm able to take care of myself from different standpoints, emotionally, physically, spiritually, I feel more about, hey, I'm energized, I'm more rejuvenated, I'm willing to give back more. So self-care is paramount, I would say, for sure. And that's when you can cascade your happiness and your positive vibes to people around you.
Well, I love that because through my lens as a baby boomer, you know, that is a distinction between the generations because you're learning that lesson way earlier. You're also, and I'm speaking about you specifically, but I do notice this in other millennials that I work with and my children who are on the younger end of the millennial spectrum. They actually listen to mentors and seek mentoring and actually pay attention to the lessons they're given, like you're just talking about. I didn't really do that. And a lot of other people I know didn't really do that. We waited for mentors to find us. We waited to learn some of these lessons the hard way, including the one about self-care. So I find that really encouraging that, that you're learning that lesson earlier and we'll be open to, you know, learning other lessons earlier for sure. So let's bridge into this conversation about leadership from the millennial perspective. So you're a leader, you lead a team. Tell us about your team, your job, you know, and what has been your leadership journey to date and where do you kind of see it going?
Sure, Dana. So for me, given my background is in engineering, technology, and business management, I'm always looking at ways in which technology can be a business enabler to drive the needs of the institution and support the goals and mission of the organization. So that's the way I look at. And I think that's part of the leadership journey. It's not just trying to see what you can do best, but looking at what are the needs, where are the gaps, where are opportunities, and how do you position yourself clearly why you want projects, why, how is it going to impact the goals of the organization. So that's my frame and analytics. I lead team. This is the bit. You know, being a technologist, you always need to understand, speak in your own language. You need to speak in terms that make sense. And in terms of visual storytelling, I think that's one of the keys of leadership, where you help them understand what you want to do and why does it matter to them in a storytelling fashion so that people can really connect with it. So that's one aspect of it. And the second one, as you're leading teams, these are people from different spectrums of your age groups, right? It's not just millennials or baby boomers that I'm working with. And sometimes you also get to work with Gen Z, which is your lower age group, right? 19 and below. So we can talk more about how that's going to impact how millennials see themselves. But I think with these teams, it's the vision that you have and how do you keep emphasizing this? Because sometimes when we go into meetings and when you're leading teams, you're always looking at, here's my to-do list. I just want to get these things done. But it's more about transformative leadership is what I would say. It's how collaborative you are. How passionate are you about the project? How inspiring you are. And these are things that are very intangible. And then the second aspect is your soft skills. It's more about how good of a listener you are. And this has been a very challenging thing for me. I love to talk. So how do you step back and listen? Listen in the sense, really listen, not for the sake of replying, right? So it's how do you build those soft skills? Because people really value people who care for them, who are willing to take the time to listen to their needs, and then helping them find their own solution. And the third aspect, I would say, it's the communication part of it. It's how well can you build relationships by just really focusing your attention on them. So I think that's been my leadership style, which I really enjoy. And I was more of a to-do list kind of a person saying, I just have these 10 action items. Can you just give me responses? But I've realized if you want to be seen as a leader, and here's an example I give to myself. If I'm in a meeting and if somebody treats me in a certain fashion, I would love to work with them more. And why can't I be that person for somebody else? So that's the way in which I've fine-tuned my mind and being mindful of how other people receive what you're talking to them about is really important as a leader.
So, you know, what's fascinating to me about what you just said, first of all, I agree with all of it as far as, you know, the core elements of leadership. But it's also what you just did was you just articulated what I call timeless leadership wisdom, right? It just those, if you go back and read leadership books from 100 years ago, you will find those same kind of themes. Now, you won't find them articulated the same way. They don't use words like people skills. They use words like character, and so the vocabulary has changed a little bit, but what it means underneath hasn't changed a bit. And, I find that really encouraging. But I'm also interested in, and I'll tell you why, I'm interested in that shift of identity from the to-do list person to the leader. And I'll tell you why. I have a client right now who is making this shift. Not fast enough according to her boss, which is why I'm working with her. and it is an identity shift. Her definition of success for herself is more about getting through that to-do list. And she gets easily overwhelmed. And we're moving her to a position of leadership where, the to-do list is something you manage. I mean, we all have to deal with that no matter how high up we are. But that she can have an opinion about the other people around her on her team. She has an additional job, and she's capable in that job of seeing those gaps like you're talking about, and seeing opportunities, and not just focused on her own output, but her success being tied to not only the output of others, but the overall health of the organization. That is a big identity shift, to see yourself, A, as responsible for that, and then B, as capable in that context. So tell us about what you remember about your identity shift, and you're probably still going through it. I mean, I am, and I'm much older than you. I think it's a constant shift, but what has it been like for you?
I mean, right off my list would be, it's very uncomfortable because you're feeling you're getting into a different landscape which you have no control about. And then you're always thinking, what would others think of me? How am I projecting myself? And you have the sense of vulnerability that comes out, and you think, is it really worth making this shift? Why does this even matter to me? So those are times of over-rumination and self-doubt which we have. And as a women, I think that's psychologically more ingrained. Because in my usual meetings, my feedback question would be, how am I doing? What should I be doing differently? And this is something that millennials are always encouraged to ask. But then as you're handling people with different generations, there are subtle ways in which you pivot the kind of feedback that you're asking for, but frame it in a slightly different way. So here's what I've been doing, say, for example, rather than asking, how am I doing, which projects a sense of insecurity to people around me.
It does.
And this is from one of my mentors. She said, hey, rather say this, here's what I'm thinking. Does this meet your expectations? And that's more like a subtle way of ensuring that you're capable of doing what you're doing, but also seeking feedback from people around you on your work. So that's one way in which I've been transitioning my identity shift. And the second is, how are you presenting yourself, not just in your meetings, but you might go to different meetings across the institution, but people are always thinking, how is she articulating? How is she carrying herself? So those are things that you also need to be cognizant of if you're looking at spreading your identity, not just within the silo that you're working with or the projects. It's across the institution, so that when future opportunities come up, you're seen as somebody who's capable of handling it across different domains. So that's another aspect. And the next one would be, as you pointed out, having the right kind of mentors. And I see it in two different ways. One is acting as a sounding board, where you're just venting things that you seem to think it's working a different way. But the other aspect is also people who believe in you, who champion for you, and also help you understand things in a different perspective, especially when you get a lot of feedback as you're growing as a leader. People might have different opinions about you. Some would be happy, some would be unhappy with the way you're looking at it. But then as far as your conscience is clear that this is for the greater good of the institution or for the project, and you have the buy-in from key stakeholders, you got to overcome that barrier of, okay, it's not just about what people are thinking of me. That's at a very low level. I need to focus on what's up front. Let me have this forward-thinking approach.
Yeah, and I value what you're saying, because it's giving insight into that identity shift, understanding that you actually have to own your own opinion and that you operate within a system, right? I mean, a lot of the time, leadership is portrayed as, the dictator who's in charge of everything. And I know systems that work with a dictator. They still don't work like that. The dictator feels as helpless as everybody else on some certain things. And so we got to let go of that mindset. And I think you're right that stepping into a true leadership perspective means understanding your role and the way that you can work in that system. Now, even though the conversation we're having right now, like I said, it feels like timeless leadership wisdom, which I think is awesome. I do observe, that millennials are coming into the workplace. As I said, when we open, pretty soon you're going to be more than half the workforce because us old people are starting to retire and die. I do see the millennials bringing a lot of new values with them, some of which are very encouraging when it comes to this leadership perspective, because I believe they bring a lot of people skills. I'm hoping it's because they're learning the lessons from the boomers and the generations that go before them, because they're open to learning those lessons. But, I see them bringing in good people skills, even though they're sometimes challenged with people skills. It's an odd thing. There's some of you that are very strong and some that are stuck in their screens, and I don't know if it's possible to generalize there. But there's also this value for, let's just call it work-life flexibility, which I generalize as, valuing that people have whole lives and that we don't need to sacrifice ourselves for our work to be successful. So I'm wondering, do you see any evidence of values like that beginning to change the culture that you work in, or the cultures that you're aware of? Because I know you work in a lot of different groups and are exposed to a lot of different people. Do you see millennials, when you project forward, making an impact with these kinds of different values?
Absolutely, Dana. I was looking at a recent report from Deloitte. They had a millennial survey for 2017, and they were looking at what drives millennials, what goes in their head, right? Which seems to be a lot. And there were a couple of key insights that stood out. One is millennials are more focused about not their roles or their identities. It's about how businesses can create a positive outcome for the society. So they're looking at, is this a cost-worthy effort that I want to be part of? And that gives them a lot of satisfaction. So it's not just the instant gratification about themselves, it's also about how meaningful are the causes that I'm involved with. And the second one that really stood out is we always look at millennials having less loyalty to the organizations that they're part of. They're always looking at what's next. But it was interesting that the Deloitte survey, to the other side of the spectrum, it said millennials are more focused about stable jobs, given the kind of environments that we are operating within. So they're looking for more stability so that they can have family work-life balance. And almost 65% said they would look for jobs which are not consultant or freelancing, but gives them work-life flexibility by having a regular 9-to-5 kind of a job. Because overall, that helps them with the well-being, the happiness that they get through, the kind of satisfaction that they get through, that they're able to balance both their professional and their personal lives. And that ties with the overall theme of self-care, which seems to be more important for a lot of millennials. Mm-hmm. So I think the landscape is shifting. And as we millennials, as you mentioned, are getting into closer to the end of the spectrum, at least for some of us who are like 30 and above.
Yet.
Yeah, I mean, we're still trying to figure it out, but I think the sense of maturity comes in saying, okay, about how to find and enjoy stages of life. It's not just about your professional identity. It's more about what matters to me at the end of the day. And would this be a decision that I'm going to regret, or if I'm going to feel proud of? And those are things that are part of the values and cultures that you grow up in as well. Say, for example, me coming from an Asian culture, family is really important. But at the same time, my parents have focused on how do you empower yourself or your kids so that they are independent and can make their own decisions. But at the same time, you also need to understand the values of the Indian culture, where you got to enjoy certain aspects of life and see the different stages of it as well. So for me, it's more about, it's great to have all the recognition, getting all the accolades, but it's also about how do you focus on your personal commitments towards your family and the society back home.
Well, every generation has to balance that, and what I am encouraged about when I look at millennials is that in my generation, there was this just assumption that you had to sacrifice yourself for work to be successful, and I love that you guys are sort of challenging that. There's still a lot of evidence that the people who sacrifice themselves for work tend to be more successful. which is sad. On the other hand, there's a lot of jobs where that's totally unnecessary. And if we can start filling them with people who value and are valued for their whole selves, including the things they do outside of work, maybe we'll actually penetrate the top layer too.
That's very true, Dana. And look at it in this way. As you're looking at leaders from the baby boomer generation, they have kids like you have from the millennial generation. So when they're talking with their kids, they understand the challenges that they face in the work-life balance domain. And I think that gives them a lot of awareness as to, hey, so my employers would also be facing similar situations, right? So I got to be more compassionate and empathetic towards what they're trying to do. So helping them build a successful career, but also giving them the work-life flexibility. I think it's two ways. It's millennials need to stand up and help the organizations understand why they're looking for more flexibility, and then tie it to the institution's needs, saying, hey, I might be more productive if I get this flexibility. So I'm at peace saying that, hey, my kids and my family are fine back home and I can focus more on work. And at the same time, for the employers as well, helping, being more upfront, saying we understand your situations. And I think when the conversation comes from both ends, there's a common ground which you can work along.
Yep. Well, I certainly hope so. And I think so. I see evidence of that. One other thing along this that I wanted to talk about here before we wrap up is, so we talked about how the values that you're bringing hopefully will help us evolve our work cultures. Do you see evidence that might also help evolve our cultures around gender and racial discrimination? Is there less tolerance among you and your peers for those kinds of discrimination that you think might actually shift the culture?
I'm a big proponent of thought-based diversity, which is way beyond gender or because of the racial or ethnic backgrounds that you belong to. Mm-hmm. Everybody has a seat at the table is what I believe in, Dana. Women from prior generations have worked so hard, both women and men, being allies in our journey towards success. And I think once the table opens up to get views from different people, from different perspectives of lives, I think that's when we can position ourselves as a global entity in terms of competing across the world. I think that's how institutions need to see themselves. And after a point, I think it might sound cliched, but there are obviously going to be barriers, conscious bias, unconscious bias. Those are going to exist. It's more about how confident are you and creating a strong support system from family, mentors, and your management and leadership, both within and outside of the organization, and just looking at the path forward. I think that's how I see myself in the near future.
I really like that perspective for a couple of reasons. I was hopeful, let's go back, rewind 5 years ago, when I first started kind of writing and about women in leadership and stuff, about 5 years ago, maybe before that. I was really hopeful that my generation was the last generation that had to sort of, bang through the barriers, And yet next week I'm posting a blog on a book written by a woman in the military who experienced combat. And it's a fascinating story. I really recommend everybody read it. It's called Shoots Like a Girl. And I hope to have the author, MJ Hagar, on the show sometime.
That'd be fantastic.
Yeah. But I'm reading her story going, no, it's not dying with my generation. Her generation, which she's probably she's older than you, but not terribly. She's probably more young Gen X. But anyway, she definitely, banged her head on a lot of doors. And so I think you're right. I think that what I've learned in the last 5 years is that, those biases are even deeper than I had thought. And we are going to that your generation probably is going to have to keep, pushing through. But stories like hers, stories like yours, many others, it is possible, but we have to not give up, which is why I'm excited about the conversation we talked about having again on this show about sitting at the table and, exploring the deeper meanings of that and why it's important, et cetera. Because I think we have to keep that drumbeat going. But I want to just close and ask you to talk a little bit about something you just said, which is fascinating. You're talking about thought diversity at the table, which speaks to what we're learning in group research about the strength of teams, and that when teams are diverse in terms of their thinking styles and everyone is allowed to play a role, no one's sort of shamed into silence, teams are more productive and they produce better results. That's what the research is saying. And I think that, our faces and our bodies right now are proxies for thought patterns, right? Like men and women are intellectually much closer than everybody gives us credit for. We're socialized differently. But at least if we have a diverse looking group of people at the table, we have a slightly better chance of diverse thinking styles. But I agree with what you're saying, that it's really about the thinking styles. The strength of the team is ultimately about the thinking styles, and the gender and racial pieces of it are just, they're pieces of that diversity. How do you experience that? And in your leadership style, how do you work to bring thought diversity to the table?
So let me share this example. I happened to run into someone in the elevator, and that's one of the ways in which, as a millennial leader, you try to make more connections, right, across the institution. And so this is a young guy. He's interning, and I happen to know him through the elevator conversation. And then we just met for coffee. And I asked him, so what do you think of this institution? How can we change things? Are there things that you would like to share? The first thing that he told me was, hey, I'm just too young. I'm just 18, 19. I'm just doing an internship. I don't know if my values really count, if my insights really make any difference. But that's thought diversity, right? As a 19-year-old, you would have a very different perspective. So 10 years ago, I would have had a very different perspective on things that I'm looking at. And sometimes the best ideas come from people like that. And assuring him, hey, irrespective of where you are in your career or the age group that you belong to, whatever you're saying is relevant. And I want to give some time to hear your feedback. And I think that's exactly what millennials have to do. And this goes both ways, Dana, for the baby boomers, because you asked, how are baby boomers relevant, right? Because the millennials are energetic, inspired, passionate. But you know what? We miss the experience. We need to have seasoned people like you who've been through a lot of challenges and who can help us navigate through career, personal, professional, different scenarios that you would encounter. And the second aspect is, for people like this intern that I met, Gen Z, if I hadn't asked him for feedback, I'm not sure if somebody else would specifically ask him for, right? Because you're always looking at being in certain ranks in order to solicit feedback. But how do you encourage people from, different aspects to speak up? I think that's the way the world needs to evolve. And as millennials, apart from doubting the fact that we know it all, I think it's up to us to start looking at the next generation who's going to invade the workforce sooner or later and see how we can work collaboratively, being in the middle of the spectrum, and act as a bridge between the baby boomers, the Gen Z, and then create a very cohesive environment so that all of us can thrive for the greater good of the institutions.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent perspective and a good one to end on, because we're out of time. So thank you very much, Priyanka, again for your insights. And I look forward to trying to put together a conversation around sitting at the table and women in leadership in the months and the shows ahead. And thank you for continuing to be a part of our journey at InPower Coaching.
It's been such a pleasure, Dana, and I really appreciate the opportunity. And this was a really interesting conversation for me to have as well. And you've been an absolute delight to work with and a great mentor as well. So that's how I see this conversation too.
Yep, me too. Mentoring shared. Well, thank you. So for everyone else, I invite you to pull up a cup every Tuesday at noon Eastern time and join us at coffeebreak.inpowercoaching.com. We have multiple live venues, YouTube, Facebook, live on our video platform, on the webinar platform. And we look forward to having you here again next Tuesday. So take care, and thanks again, Priyanka.
Thanks, Dana.